Hi, it's Demetrius.
Hey, Demetrius, it's Mark. They're in.
Nice. Taking it to the next level.
Launching Phase 2 of Gable Media on October 7th. 7th.
Hi there, I'm Evan Troxel. Welcome to my podcast about how technology is changing the architectural profession. Welcome back to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. In this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with Reg Prentice. Reg is the founder at Tonic DM, which is a startup in the AEC world that's been operating for a few years. And right as Reg had started Tonic DM is when I initially got in contact with him when I was teaching a course in emerging technology at Cal Poly, and he came recommended to me as a guest lecturer. So when I first met him, he had just started Tonic. Previous to Tonic, he had worked at Gary Partners and at Gensler. Reg gave a presentation to my students, and he really got me thinking about where the value in an architect lies. So that's where this whole conversation started, and we are continuing that today. I wanted to definitely bring up these ideas on the show, and I thought there was nobody better to do that than Reg Prentice. So Reg is originally from New Zealand, where he got a Bachelor of Building Science and a Bachelor of Architecture degree. You may detect a hint of his Kiwi accent. Anyway, Reg is a fantastic guy. I love hanging out and talking with him. I get to see him a few times a year because of what he's doing with Tonic, and also at various conferences like Autodesk University, which isn't happening this year, but that's another topic. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Reg. I always enjoy the thought that he puts into some of these ideas, and I think that's what originally captivated me with the presentation that he gave to my students and has provoked a lot of thinking. I hope that you will be equally provoked and that maybe we can start to talk about potential solutions to some of these problems. All right, so here it is. Without further ado, my conversation with Reg Prentice. It's great to talk to you again.
Great. Thanks, Evan.
Yeah, so when we first met, I had got a recommendation from a professor at Cal Poly about potential lecturers for my class. I think that's when I initially reached out to you over email. And I think you were like recommended as a BIM guy or an IT guy, or I don't know what your actual title was, but you're from Gensler. But I think by the time I got in touch with you, you had started your company Tonic. Does that sound about right?
Yep. Yeah.
So I think it would be interesting, maybe real quick, to just tell people where you've come from in the let's just say, the just previous to where you are now with Tonic.
Yeah. So my background was in architecture. So I have a Bachelor of Architecture degree, but pretty quickly went into the IT CAD management side and worked for Frank Gehry for 11 years and then Gensler for 9 years. And during that time, my interest mostly spanned 2D CAD and what you might call 1D information. And really, I started to focus more just on information in the design process and how information flows between designers and between design companies. And that's what led me to start Tonic, which is about project information management, very much focused on information rather than modeling or some specific design process or design activity.
So with the course that I was teaching and that you came in to lecture on, and kind of figuring out via email before the class happened that you had started this company and that you guys were doing this with Tonic, basically your presentation came from left field to me, right? Because you started talking about the mechanisms of design, what the purpose of it was for, how people document decisions, what kind of a problem is design. And so I found it fascinating. And I think, that was probably when I was taking a lot of notes. So some of the things that I thought we could talk about today kind of revolve around that initial presentation, because I think that those concepts that you talked about are still something that a lot of people either don't identify as the definition of design, for instance, or what the purpose of documenting decisions are, but also like the way in which you've started this company to solve that particular set of problems and how that fits into this larger ecosystem of tools that we use nowadays to do exactly that. I mean, something that we were talking about pre-show is like now there's like these endless possibilities of where to put your stuff.
Right.
And it becomes incredibly difficult to manage the information from a global perspective of where did we make a decision? And I mean, where by like what tool did we make it in? And then how do we start to pull all that together? And I mean, that's really what a document set of record drawings for a project are, right? Like they're a documentation
Right.
of a series of decisions. They don't show you every line item or every piece of that paper trail that got there, but that is what the drawings are showing. They are showing the outcome of those decisions.
Yeah, and for a specific purpose, usually to communicate those decisions to the construction team and or the jurisdiction authorities. So they also have a purpose as well as, or a target audience as well as a purpose.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that I think this starts to get into is what is the purpose or what is the best value of an architect in that process? Because that to me is where things get during your lecture got really interesting, was when you start talking about where the value of the architect lies, and is it in the drawing of the details of how the contractor is going to put things together, which we all know, you know, a lot of contractors don't look at that stuff, but we still have to provide it to get the agency's approval. So there's lots of like weird overlaps. There's lots of kind of maybe misidentifications of who should be providing what information. And yet here we are in this really kind of messy process that we're all kind of stuck in. Can we take it back? I want to take it back to where you kind of first started the presentation, which was, well, you said that there's two mechanisms, and I believe they were to create options and then make decisions.
Right.
And that to me is an incredibly simple statement to say about the purpose of design.
Right. So the creating options is what most people think of when they think of design.
Mm-hmm.
And it's expanding the solution space. So when we take a design problem and we think of design solutions, we can sketch out lots of ideas for what those solutions might be. And that's often, culminates in a pinup or some kind of expression of all these great design ideas. And that's what gets most mind share because it's the most visual and the most kind of, in quotes, exciting part of the design process. But only one thing can be built ultimately.
Yeah.
And so for all the design option making, there has to be an equal and opposite process of collapsing all the options down into the thing which will be built. And that's through a series of decisions that have to be made, and often hard decisions and hard trade-offs and compromises between different options and different people's input on those options.
Yeah, I think that's one of the pieces of feedback as an architect that we get quite often, which is how in the world do you synthesize a single solution out of all of the input you get from all of the various, whether it's people, whether it's code, jurisdictional requirements, zoning, larger goals of an entity, future purpose, flexibility. There's so many pieces that are ambiguously kind of pulling in different directions on the problem. Right. And they're not ever, I shouldn't say they're not ever, but they're rarely clearly defined. And that to me is really what makes design such an interesting problem set. And a lot of times design is just trying to figure out the problem.
Right. Yeah. And I think the word synthesis is one that people probably associate with design and being an important part of design. But I think the word decision maker probably isn't a word that would commonly be used to describe an architect or designer, but that's essentially what it is. There are skills associated with making options, and those are the skills that we typically associate with design school or being a designer. But I think what's interesting is that half the problem is actually being a decision maker. And that's a much less talked about skill that designers need to be really good at, because it's the basis of synthesis. And, it's half of being a designer is cutting down the options and turning them into a single goal through a series of decisions.
It's also interesting because it's fairly indefinable, right? That process, and it's probably rarely the same twice, and so you have to be okay with that, right? Which many people are not. Many people are not okay with that. I mean, you have to be pretty okay with uncertainty, and like you talked about how there's that equal and opposite pull to collapse everything back down to a single solution. So you're talking about going from uncertainty to certainty, you hope.
Right.
And getting the consensus to do that.
That's where the designer plays, is that they play in the realm of uncertainty. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there with that designers need to be comfortable with uncertainty. And I think that's what, people who are successful designers will look at themselves and say, yes, I'm someone who is comfortable with uncertainty, but not everyone is. And maybe very few people actually are comfortable with uncertainty. And that's one of the traits, I think, of a designer that makes designers kind of special.
That's interesting.
And the ability to not just be comfortable with uncertainty and excited by uncertainty, but have the passion to resolve that uncertainty. So it's not just okay to live with the uncertainty. You have to drive to certainty as the outcome.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about like a blank page designer, I guess it doesn't matter. Blank page probably is not a realistic qualifier here. I mean, basically, the definition to me of design is that it is a transformative decision-making process that contends with potential. And that is like sky is the limit. And there's a different set of rules. And we're going to define a new language. And we have these constraints that in some cases we make up for ourselves so that we know if we're following our original parti or not. So that whole idea about contending with potential starts to play into something that you said, I think during your lecture, that I hadn't really heard before, was the concept of the wicked versus a tamed problem.
Right. Yeah. So just to review that for people, this is kind of 1970s, I think, research where problems were split into two domains. One is problems that the answer is not known, but the means to get to the answer is known. So making a flight to the moon is considered a tamed problem, not because it's easy, because it's obviously incredibly difficult, but the path to the solution can be figured out through, I guess, rational means, like, the study of physics and forces. You can figure out how to get to the moon. But things like poverty are wicked problems because just defining the problem is a big part of the problem. And there's no path to solution that is obvious. It's a trial and error and experience-based solution path. And so putting the construction industry into that mold, the contractor should be working in the tamed problem area, because the designer should be giving them the template that they need to build from. And of course, a set of construction drawings is never 100% correct, or complete. So it's not like the contractor literally gets 100% of a blueprint. The contractor still has a lot of figuring out to do, but essentially they get given what they need to build, and their job is to figure out how to build that safely, efficiently, cost consciously. So they're working in the tamed area, the designer works in the wicked problem area, because for the designer, just knowing what the problem that is a big part of solving the problem.
Yeah.
So that's when people say there's contentiousness or tension between designers and contractors in projects, which I think is probably quite common. I think understanding this would actually help both parties have more empathy towards each other.
Right.
In that if contractors understood the nature of wicked problems better, they would have more empathy for the design teams, what the design team needs to do in order to do their work. And for design teams looking at contractors, they would perhaps have more empathy for the complexity of the contractor's task, which is, let's say, no less difficult, but they are completely different problem-solving domains.
Yeah. Both valuable, right?
Right. Both necessary and
Yes.
both very complicated and requiring a lot of experience. But other than that, they are just very different types of problem that need to be solved.
And to me, there's like, okay, so this I think goes into the larger conversation of in the future profession or practice of architecture, is everybody going to play in their own piece of the puzzle to create the larger whole nicely? Or do we continue to go down this road of low trust between entities, right? Because a lot of that contentiousness not only is because maybe one party doesn't understand the other one's value, or maybe there's overlap that is not well defined, or there's lots of ifs there. But there really has been kind of a low trust environment, and it seems to. I mean, it even comes up during the education of an architect, right? Like, pro practice class. Here's what the contractor's going to do to screw you over, right? And
right.
And so it's kind of bred into, and then on the contractor side, it's like, well, look what this stupid architect drew. We don't do it like that. And so it happens from very early on. And I'm wondering, like this is a systemic issue to the profession or the AEC industry. And I'm wondering, like, how do we move beyond the current state into this kind of more future, I don't want to say utopian, but more efficient, better for everybody, kind of a thing where people do really understand the values of all of the pieces of this puzzle and aren't clashing between them? Because to me, like, if you're describing this future state, which to me is, as we can see in so many examples, it's a platform that ties all of these disparate pieces together without any loss of data or redoing of information, if at all possible, then everybody kind of has to understand in definable chunks what their contribution is and stick to it. That was a big piece of your talk, was where does the architect add value?
And I think being able to succinctly articulate value is going to be a key factor in the future of design, because anyone doing work for money should be able to succinctly articulate the value of their work. And if they can't, then they're in a reasonably precarious position. And I feel like architects and designers have not had the language to succinctly articulate their value. And if I would guess,
or they avoid it.
I probably should. Yeah, I would guess if you went to 50 architects and said, what is the value of the service you provide? My guess is you'd probably get a huge diversity of answers. You'd probably get a lot of very long answers, and maybe ones which are even kind of circuitous. And so to some extent, I think the AIA should be taking a leadership role in this, in that architects should be able to say in one sentence, this is the value that I provide for my service. And if I was to put words into architects' mouths, it would be, I take the project from uncertainty to certainty. Right. That's very few words, but it does sum up the role of the design team, and that is focused around decision making. So the design team starts with some high level of uncertainty, typically. The owner may have done quite a bit of research on their own, and so they may come to the design team with a brief, and sometimes even rooms that they need, depending on how much pre-work they've done. Sometimes the owner comes to the architect without even a site and only with a vague concept of what they want. So that's almost complete uncertainty. And the design team, through a series of explorations and decisions, has to bring that to near certainty. And that has enormous value, and not many people are good at it. So I feel like, in general, the design industry has a very bright future with a lot of work, because whether it's buildings or other things that need to be designed, experiences, etc., like there's a lot of design work that needs to be done in the world, and it seems like it's only increasing, as people move even towards designed experiences and all kinds of design being important in people's lives.
Yes.
But we have to be able to articulate that we are professionals in moving an idea from uncertainty to certainty.
I think one of the pushbacks on that isn't maybe even well stated, but I think it's understood, is that people tend to not buy uncertain things, right? They don't want to pay for that level of risk that is associated with so much uncertainty, and so they rather buy the outcome than the process.
Right. And so that's part of the sales process that designers need to perfect, right? Is being able to show an owner that they are in a position of uncertainty, and that they are therefore in a position of high risk, and the value of their project depends largely on the process of moving that from high risk, high uncertainty to low risk and low uncertainty or high uncertainty, and that designers are uniquely skilled in that transition for the project, and that when that project is in a position of certainty, then they can deal much better with the build team. The build team will be in a much better position to execute the project. And a lot of the value of the project, I would say most of the value of the project, is created during that design process.
Yeah.
There's nothing less efficient than building very efficiently something which isn't needed.
Right.
Like even if you build inefficiently, if you're building exactly what's needed, then the loss is small. If you build very efficiently, but you build something which nobody needs or doesn't meet the needs of the owner very well, then even though you built efficiently, you've just wasted your money in the broader sense.
I agree. And I feel like, and I've heard this several times over the last few years, is the outcome of that process of going from uncertainty to certainty may not equal a building. Right.
Right.
And to me, if an architect whose livelihood depends on a building getting built, or at least maybe doing the drawings for the building, were to basically convince an owner based on data, right? This decisions would, the process that you go through led to an outcome that was not a building because they didn't need it. And talk about a compelling argument, right? Of providing value.
Right. And that's where I think moving the value statement away from whatever people tend to use now to something like, we move the project from uncertainty to certainty, opens up a lot more space for design to work in.
Yeah.
But the way that design is remunerated does kind of work against that, because if design is an hourly task, either literally you're getting paid by the hour, or you are determining a fee based on the amount of work you think it's going to take, then you are incentivized to increase the number of hours or the amount of work. And for example, suggesting the owner doesn't need a new building kind of becomes off the table because it just doesn't, the architect's never going to get paid for the incredibly valuable insight that they were able to come to, which brings up alternative methods of being paid for design, which gets incredibly tricky. And I think there's been quite a bit of discussion and writing on this topic, which is, awesome. But it's so tricky that I don't think we've really got much closer to solving it.
Yeah. And so much of it is locked into just the way we've always done it that a lot of people don't see potential in alternatives there.
I think the most dangerous thing maybe is that we have confused our own value for what we charge for, when in fact they're quite different. So sometimes the value of the designer is stated as, we do the drawings, we make the drawings for the contractor to build from, which is very destructive, I think, to the profession, because it makes it seem like the value is in the documentation of the decisions, when in fact the value is in the decisions themselves, regardless of the documentation. I mean, documentation is obviously important because we need to communicate those decisions in a way other people understand, but that's not actually the value of the service. The value of the service is in the content of the drawings, not the drawings themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so you think kind of like at the end of this process is where the value of the architect should probably, I don't want to say stop, but hand off that process to a more qualified documentarian? Or like how do you see that process going at that point?
I think if you are in the business of design and you articulate your value as we move a project from uncertainty to certainty and our value is in the decisions that we make. If you are thinking about your future, would you want to invest more in the back end of documenting those decisions? Or would you want to move your service more to the front end of making bigger and more important and more strategic decisions for the owner? And not surprisingly, I would propose that designers who focus on the back end of documentation are at more risk of their service being commoditized than designers who focus on the front end of trying to become more of a trusted advisor to the owner and be involved in more important and more strategic decisions at the beginning of a project.
Right.
And it could be like once designers start doing, in quotes, construction drawings, which is often the bread and butter, I think the profession is on tenuous ground because contractors understand construction better than designers,
right.
Almost by definition, because they are contractors. And so it's tenuous territory. And so we get into this means and methods argument where we're documenting the design, but not the means and methods, which I think is actually the right way to go because the architect should be documenting the decisions they make, but not the construction specifically, which is the perfect means and methods argument. But it's when you are drawing a set of construction documents, it's very, very hard to not get into means and methods. And the more unique the design is, the harder it is to not, influence the means and methods because the construction and the design are almost one.
Yeah. It is interesting in that I think firms kind of operate with a foot in both worlds. And what I mean by that is we do design intent. We don't necessarily build for construction. And by build, I mean make our models, make our drawings for. Obviously, they are that instruction set, but there's so much risk pulled out of that. Never scale off the drawings. We can't actually deliver that model. We have to deliver these drawings instead. It's a very we get in our own way. Like I said, there's lots of gray area over who owns what responsibilities in that, and then we fight over the way things were or weren't drawn. Because it seems like the trend in the last decade has definitely been to put more in the drawings, not less, right? Which is more of a cover your ass mentality rather than a design intent mentality. And so to me, like, this all starts to point toward the bigger problem that architects really face is, what is the future of our profession and who's going to design it? Because it starts to get into deliverables, contracts, policy, agencies, education, licensure, right? Like, there's so much that revolves around this. And because if you think about it, like if we're painting a picture of a different outcome, you have to go all the way back to the education of the different parties to prepare them for that in the future, right? How do we get to there? Like, talk about a wicked problem, right?
Right, yeah. And the problem with wicked problems is often that there's no consensus on what the problem is, or even that there is a problem. And I guess that that's the case here. People also come to it with all kinds of biases and self-interest. So it does come down to being able to succinctly articulate the value of design.
Yeah.
And a school especially, you'd think would be able to, or would feel compelled to do that, and then to build up the education around that value. So that's where I think decision making is a field of study that's been around for 100 years, let's say, but you don't hear about it in design school. And I think that's an indicator to me that, one, there's a problem, and two, people don't understand the value of design, at least in the same way that I do. Because if making decisions is such a big part of design, you would think it would also be a big part of education. And decision making is a whole field of study, so it could be a big part of education. Like, if I was to employ a tradesperson to fix something in my house and they arrived with a hammer and I said, oh, I have problem A. They're like, okay, we'll hit it with a hammer, right? And, oh, I have problem B. Okay, we'll hit it with a hammer. You start to go, does this person know what they're doing? Like, are they an expert, or are they just a hack showing up with a hammer? And to relate that back to design, a designer should be able to articulate multiple ways to solve the problem of design exploration. Like, they might say, if I'm working on a school or a large project, or this kind of project, I use these tools and I use these methods. And so you would be able to have a discussion with a designer about the benefits and drawbacks of different methods of design, because they're an expert in design. And you'd also expect to be able to have that conversation about decision making. Like, when it's a large group, or when I have this kind of owner, then I use these decision techniques. When it's this kind of design problem, I'm going to lay out my decision in this way, because you'd expect them to be an expert and therefore have multiple approaches to making decisions. And I don't see that as being the case. Like, I don't see designers being educated in multiple different ways of making decisions, which have pros and cons in different circumstances.
Yeah, I think if a team is successful in landing a project, that becomes a recipe for future ways to win projects, right? We tend to want to make these things repeatable, which you can't blame people, but it also doesn't mean it's the right approach for every problem.
Right. And that's where, just with the Tonic DM product that we're working on, the future of that will seek to help people engage in decision making in a more objective, let's say explicit and thoughtful way. And branching the conversation a little bit, when it comes to the future of design technology, particularly artificial intelligence, there's definitely a group of people who are working on the idea that artificial intelligence will be able to make decisions and therefore automate some aspects or potentially all design. My view is quite different to that. I see the value of technology in this as being able to present information to the designer to help them make better decisions. And so that could be tools that look at the artifacts of design and help to organize that information around the idea of a series of decisions that have to be made. And in any project, there are, an almost infinite number of decisions that need to be made. Designers are decision factories and probably make copious numbers of decisions without even realizing how many decisions they're making. But there are key decisions and there are very difficult decisions in design that need to be made explicit and carefully worked through with the stakeholders and with key decision makers. And being able to perform that at a better and at a very high level, I think will serve designers well. So my goal for the profession is that owners would say, oh, I need architects on this job because we have some really difficult decisions to make. And we need expert decision makers, expert design decision makers in order to help us through that process and to get the most value out of the money that we're going to spend. To me, that would be a huge win for the design community when owners reflect on their use of the design community in that way.
Let's take a pause here in the episode and thank our first sponsor of Troxel Podcast, and it is Layer App, the must-have app for Revit users. Are you tired of digging for project photos, files, and field data days, if not months after it's captured? That's the power of Layer. Layer takes all of your project-related data, photos, and files and makes them accessible with the click of a button right in Revit. Find out more and start your free 14-day trial at layer.team, that's layer.team/TRXL. By the way, if you listen to episode 280 of the Entree Architect podcast, also here on Gable Media, you can hear my friend Mark's interview with Zach Soflin, the architect turned software developer who created Layer App. Get your free trial at layer.team/TRXL. That way they know you heard about it here on this show, and that would be much appreciated if you let them know that specific piece of info. So again, that's layer.team/TRXL. And now back to my conversation with Reg Prentice. I'm thinking now would be a good time to maybe shift the conversation more towards technology and get a little bit more into what you guys are doing with Tonic. But, at the technology at large within our profession, I mean, just building off of what you just talked about making decisions. To me, it seems now like table stakes for any project team are that those decisions are backed up by data, right? And I don't mean just like you recorded how you made the decision or why you made the decision or when you made the decision, but what data led to that decision. It seems like that is more and more of a requirement nowadays, not only because of, maybe the building code requires an energy model that's going to show how the building has to perform once it's built, but because owners in many aspects are now requiring that level of attention to be paid. Like they want to know that your decision was based on data. I mean, have you seen that trend? And is that the kind of thing that's going into the thinking behind Tonic or any other tools that you see out there? Because to me, it seems like if let's say you're designing a new building and you're not taking environmental data, actual data, not just rules of thumb, not just training that you got in school, but actual location-based geodata on the project as a very rudimentary example, like you're not even going to get past step one with many clients today because the sophistication is getting greater and the requirements are going up.
I think it's complicated. And I would say my trust of the use of data in design is very low. I think it definitely has a place, right? And I think it should be, its position should be higher. The environmental data is a good example. where design teams should be very carefully looking at the climate, getting climate data for the site, and then using that data to inform their decisions. But with any data, it's the story behind the data is very manipulatable. And I think what I've tended to see, unfortunately, is people trying to justify their decision after the fact by finding data that supports it.
Yeah, post-justification, yes.
Even rendering, I think, is something which falls into this. Like, to me, the value of rendering would be for the designers to inspect the rendering and to get insights from it and say, oh, yeah, it does look a little odd there. I think we should fix that, right? And so let's say 99 out of 100 renderings should be used by the design team to critique their own work and make their work better. Whereas it tends to be the very careful choice of lighting and angles in order to justify a design, right?
Right.
And when owners are asking for data-driven or data-influenced design, the outcomes of that don't make me think that it is a genuine process. Like, a lot of firms will do research, in quotes, on things like the most efficient office layouts for generating ideas, which would be very useful for companies that are creative, or that are doing research, or they do hospital layouts that are based on supposedly patient outcomes or the happiness of the work staff, the doctors and healthcare professionals. But when you look at it, you kind of go, it looks to me like someone had an idea they thought was cool, and then they tried to back it up with research. For example, if an idea is genuinely a good one and it's supported by research, you'd expect to see that dominate at least that firm's designs, because they did the research. They found that this idea was the best one. But often you'll see that idea occurs in one design, but not in subsequent designs, right? Because maybe there was a different designer from the same office and they just had a different idea. So I agree in that designers do need to be more data-driven, but getting designers to that point is more than just a lip service, right? It's more than research in the name of marketing or research in the name of justifying features that the designers wanted anyway. And I don't think that the data needs to make boring buildings or needs to make buildings that look a certain way. It's much more abstract than that, I think. Like, you could take environmental analysis of a site and you could come up with 100 completely different styles of building, which are driven from that, right? But people tend to fear that it's going to look somehow hippie, right, if it's influenced by environmental data. And it could be that the data does reduce design to a more scientific outcome if designers aren't skilled enough to integrate the data in creative ways, or if the data is allowed to drive the design exclusively, right, rather than being one part of a larger set of considerations. So that's where I think when a designer starts with a project which is largely uncertain, their first tasks involve collecting information. And that should be environmental information, code information, site information, and starting to build a set of data from which they can start to design from. And that's how I see it more than the design, the data driving the specifics of the design. The data forms one part of the context from which the design will emerge. And in terms of decision making, when you start a project in that condition of uncertainty, you're going to start making some pretty big decisions. And the way those decisions are made can drive value or it can subvert value. So when you start, you definitely have limited information, not just because all information is going to be limited, but because there's limited time to gather the information. And so when you make decisions, you know that later on in the process, more information will emerge that may impact that previous decision. Mm-hmm. So having those decisions documented explicitly, I think, is important. And there's a tool called the Lean A3, which I think is a good tool for this purpose, because what it attempts to do is on a single sheet of A3 paper, which is the equivalent of 11 by 17 in the US, you should be able to record what was the decision, what were the options, what were the criteria for making the decision, what were the options considered, and who made the decision, and why did they choose a particular option to meet those criteria. And by keeping it on one side of an 11 by 17, it forces people to be brief and therefore, not get into documentation overload. But later on, you will expose new information, which may well change that decision. Mm-hmm. And so when you go back to that A3 sheet, you can say, did we consider this new information? Does this new information materially change what we would have decided? And if it does, changing that decision may well be a good value for the project, even though it will be disruptive and there'll be collateral damage of decisions that were made based on that previous larger decision. But then you can really make a decision with the owner, like, does this new information mean we should change what we started with? Mm-hmm. And if so, here's what the impact will be, and then you can manage to that.
Right. I've actually heard of, I think it was just a small residential firm would make that the last sheet in their drawing set.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So it was actually part of their deliverable. and then it was never a question about where that information lived. It was always in that spot. And at any time, anybody on the project for any reason, all the way through construction could always flip to that back sheet and say, why did we choose to do it this way? And there it was. Like, right. That information was readily available.
I mean, that's perfect. Yeah. And I think experience would allow people to get the right balance of, you don't want to do that for decisions which are too small, because you would just have an overload of decision-making documentation.
Yeah.
So knowing what that cutoff is, so that the important decisions that, and maybe the risky ones that people are going to challenge later, get documented and included, and the ones which are unlikely to ever be, need to be reviewed or are too small, just don't, and that just lives in people's heads, so that there's a good balance between, having the benefits of the documentation, but not overloading the team with too much information.
That makes a lot of sense, and I don't know exactly how you do that, what the mechanics are of deciding, no pun intended, like what actually needs to be, I guess it's not really a pun, but like what do you hang on to, or what do you just let pass through? And then I think even larger than that is, how do you get that information to the larger staff of the company, for instance, right? And so that it, like you said, so it doesn't just live in the heads of the people who are on the project, which is often a very small team, because it would seem like that information would be valuable enough, especially if you're taking that time to identify it, write it down. So you're basically codifying it so that it is useful not only in the future for yourself, but for other people too.
Right. And this gets into the knowledge management territory.
Exactly. Yeah.
Of which there are people who have thought about this much more than me. But I'm a bit of a knowledge management cynic, mm-hmm. in that design is a very human process and a very human profession. And people learn through experience. There are already an enormous number of books on all aspects of design with people's experiences and opinions, but there's a limited ability of people to consume that information. Mm-hmm. And the same goes with a firm. It's like, over time, over my career, there's been an enormous amount of effort put into making tacit information explicit and trying to create documentation of best practices in design, etc. But I think there's very limited ability for people to consume that information. Sure. And they tend to go to the people they know have the experience and just ask them. And I just don't think that that's a bad thing. We just have to embrace the fact that design is a very human profession and that there are experienced and very skilled people who have enormous value to the firms they work in. And part of their role is to mentor and assist and give that knowledge out on a one-to-one basis. It's not efficient in a computer sense, right? But it's effective.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what the profession is built on, which, right, is like this apprenticeship kind of approach of working in an office, gaining that experience, doing it time and time again, and then repeat. Then the student becomes the master, right? And then it repeats.
Yeah. One of the collateral damages, I think, from the CAD era was that when drawings were done by hand, they were on large tables, so they were very visual in the studio.
Right.
And someone walking past would be tempted, and this would be a good thing to take someone to task on their drawing and ask them about it. And it was an opportunity for mentorship. And once drawings went inside the computer and were only available through a small window, usually zoomed in rather than a big picture view, I think that opportunity for mentorship was damaged. And I don't think people realized, or they didn't express it in that way. Like, oh, look, we brought in this new technology, which has great benefits, but it also has this huge problem. And that mentorship is now much harder than it used to be. I think that needs to be acknowledged. And luckily, screens are bigger now, but it's still drafting. The act of drafting I think is more personal now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and to add fuel to that fire, now everybody's in their own location, right? So it's absolutely, it doesn't matter how big your monitor is, no one else is going to see it.
Right. And so I think that's something that firms should openly discuss is how are we going to engage in mentorship? Because mentorship in the moment is hugely inefficient. I mean, you're paying your most experienced person and they may or may not have any insights for the person they're mentoring.
Yeah.
But without that, it's hard to see how the profession can grow over time.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns that I have, and many other people have expressed it as well, is when there is the work from home environment or a hybrid environment of some people in the office, some people at home. I mean, we can all pretty much guarantee that because there's children and they don't have a school to go to, their parents will be at home. And therefore, you automatically have like a hybrid environment, potentially. Let's just say offices did open back up and schools haven't, right? You have this disparity amongst experiences where the people in the office have one experience, the people who are not in the office have let's just call it second-class citizen for many reasons. And it has to do with collaboration. It has to do with overhearing what else is going on or overseeing what's going on, kind of the things that you were just talking about. And what's interesting to me is that every single firm out there is dealing with this highly possible future independently. And there is no larger kind of collaborative effort going on here, profession-wide, industry-wide, however you want to frame it, to solve this problem so that it's similar. I mean, the solutions can be similar for everybody. Like that should all be shared information and shared knowledge. That's just kind of how I see it. Is why do we always kind of come at these problems as if they're our own problems only? Because they're most definitely not. And it doesn't mean that everybody needs to even try to solve them the same way. But let's say we're not going to tell anybody else about it. And if we weren't, we're not going to tell anybody else about it either. And so we're not going to learn from others' mistakes as well as we could, and we're not going to go through those successes together. We're all just kind of on our own. And I think for the most part, that's how this profession has kind of squandered its potential for so long, is that there's so much competitiveness and kind of to get back to where this conversation started when you were talking about how there's so much potential out there for design. There's so much potential for the type of work that we can do, and yet we're so competitive about it and insulated about it and isolated, acting in isolation. It seems very odd to me. At the same time, like, I don't know how you would organize a larger group think. So I don't have any answers there, but I think like these problems are enormous, and everybody's struggling with the same problems and trying to solve them independently. It seems like there would be some benefit to coming together and having some agreement about a direction.
Right. Yeah.
And that's just to deal with this problem at hand, but the problems that you're speaking about with mentorship and the future of our profession and whose hands that lies in is a very scary proposition.
Right.
As to the future of architecture.
I think it is. It's always, it's not necessarily useful to be alarmist, but there is a creeping over time towards technology kind of becoming a barrier to discussions around design and even to participation in design. So the technical barrier between being a non-designer and being a designer in the past was very low, in the sense that the pencil was the means of expression. And, people became incredibly skilled at using pencils and pens, and I wasn't one of them, even though I did practice in that era. I did not have good penmanship, but the barrier was using the pen. And then when 2D CAD came along, the ability to use a computer and to work and to operate the computer software became a hurdle which a designer needed to cross. And many people became reasonably good at CAD. I would say only a few people became really, really good at it. But most people could get by in CAD. And so they transitioned from the drafting board to CAD. But BIM is an order of magnitude more difficult again, whereas most people, let's say, made the transition from drafting to being adequate CAD users. I think the ability to be an adequate BIM user is even a higher barrier. And to being an excellent BIM user is really, really high.
Yeah.
So I see that as a problem in the profession too. And the people who are really good at computers tend to dismiss it and just say people should learn, blah, blah, blah. But it's actually a way of thinking. And that, I think, is a problem for the profession too, in that if only people who think a certain way can become excellent users of the software, then the profession is going to vastly disproportionately kind of reward those people and people who just don't think that way. There's a risk that they become less valued, I think. And I think the problem is technology's problem. Like, technology is not diverse. And, I think this is a good time to talk about, a good period of history to talk about diversity. And when software is complicated, it's going to impact the diversity of who gets to participate. And I think that's something we need to think carefully about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm sure you've read that open letter to Autodesk.
I've read part of it. I don't think I read the whole thing.
To me, one of the big kind of read between the lines takeaways that I had was people were basically complaining. Again, this could be totally off base, but I think people were complaining that it's too complex. The software is too complex. We want it to be easier. And it's interesting, right? Because you've got apps on your phone that are technology has proven that you can make it so that it is easy to use and powerful and delightful, right? But I would argue, as I have on previous episodes with some other guests, is that Like there are apps that we are forced to use by our own volition, like we created this problem, or we willingly went along with it to use apps that we hate to use, and now our jobs depend on them. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic that not a lot of people maybe take a step back to try to understand, but it's absolutely the case. And so then if you actually have apps that people hate to use that your job depends on, are you going to do a good job in them?
Right.
Because people take shortcuts all day long, every day using this software and short circuit their potential in it, right? Of what it possibly can do, but all in the name of like just making it easier on themselves, right? I totally understand that. It is a very interesting kind of problem that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Because it is 22 years old. It's this piece of software that we're talking about here, Revit, is 22 years old, and it's only getting more and more complex.
It's a complex problem because the network effect in technology will centralize the population on a single tool or a single protocol. So, and the network effect is incredibly powerful. Mm-hmm. So, Autodesk may or may not have been, explicitly leveraged the network effect, but they're the beneficiaries of it. And it's very, very hard to break that. So even when everybody agrees that, a different tool is better, no one will be able to, It's the stickiness of the tool in the profession is almost insurmountable, right?
Yeah. It's like the gravitation of a black hole. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's not any one person's or even one company's fault. It's just the way the world is. But the profession does need to think about that. And it would be possible for firms to deliberately lower their efficiency in order to increase diversity of tools. Like, I personally am an advocate for multiple design tools on a project, like, say, Grasshopper, as well as Revit, as well as, someone using Cinema 4D or something. I think if people are open and if they take the time to understand other people's processes and what other people are trying to do, then it is less efficient. But it's possible to run multiple tools together and to do it without, without much downside, I would say, given the upside.
Well, especially if you're redefining the value of where an architect is valuable.
Yeah. And the classic case is with Revit, that a designer who's skilled at hand drawing or SketchUp or maybe Grasshopper could do 10 options and make a decision on which option is the best in the time it would take someone in Revit to do one option, right? Mm-hmm. So it's actually more efficient to break out, do the experimentation in, say, SketchUp, and then just put the answer back in Revit, than it would be to try to do all the experimentation in Revit. And from the Revit zealots' point of view, this is a terrible mistake because we just became very inefficient because now we have to redo, in quotes, work in Revit.
Right.
But if you look at it in the broader picture, you just saved an enormous amount of time by breaking out of Revit, making the decision in the tool where that decision is best made,
right,
and then just putting the answer back in Revit.
Where a completely different set of decisions has to be made.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to say that Revit is not, in quotes, a design tool, because there are people who think like Revit and they design very effectively in Revit. Mm-hmm. But it is not everybody's design tool, because not everybody thinks like Revit thinks. Some people think like SketchUp thinks, or think like Grasshopper thinks.
Right. Yeah, all fantastic comments. I think we should probably start to wrap things up here.
Yeah.
This has been fun. I've asked everybody on the show so far to share a personal hack, something that you do to help yourself perform better. Is there anything you can share on that side of things?
Yeah. For me, I try to optimize the times that I'm kind of in the zone or, getting flow. And for me, the time of day to have coffee, the making sure I eat regularly,
Mm-hmm.
Eating between meals to keep my energy levels up, and sleeping as well. So it's kind of like a biocycle hack for me. I think if I can keep a pretty good regimen of getting to sleep early, getting up, having my coffee at the same time, and then eating throughout the day, I can kind of maximize the amount of time that I'm kind of in flow.
I align very closely with that. I'm really interested in kind of what your schedule is therefore like. Like what have you learned about yourself that you now have really doubled down on?
So I always used to wonder why I would go to sleep during the day, particularly kind of in the early afternoon.
Yeah.
And I tried all kinds of things from exercise, food. Turns out it's just how much sleep I get,
Uh-huh.
Which shouldn't really be surprising. Like it used to be 8 hours when I was younger. Like if I didn't get 8 hours sleep, I would go to sleep during the day.
Uh-huh.
Now it's more like 7 probably. But, I try to get to bed by, be in bed ready to go to sleep by 10:30. If it's later than that, then the next day I'll start to get sleepy. So
Yeah, I think it's funny that I think usually the experimentation that happens around that is about fighting sleep rather than addressing it, right?
Yeah.
Or the lack of.
And I certainly went through all that. It's so compelling to be like Margaret Thatcher, right? And only need 3 hours sleep a night or something, and you think,
Yeah.
wow, like imagine how much I could get done. But at least for me, I'm just not that person. Like 8 hours would be excellent, and 7 hours is kind of the.
It's funny now because we've been talking about data. So I'm scrolling right now through this app that I've been using it looks like I've been using it since 2013 on my iPhone to track my sleep.
Uh-huh.
And it's not 100% accurate because when there's more than one person in the room, it's probably not as accurate as it could be. But I find it interesting to kind of look at those trends and use those trends to see what the actual information is, right? So like when you go to bed, when do you wake up, what's your average time in bed? And I have to say it's been for a few years now. Like my average sleep time is about 7.5 hours. And I think there's a lot of people out there who, they say I can operate on 4 hours of sleep. I'm at my best when I get this much, that much. It's really interesting to look at that data and see if your perception of yourself is matching up with the reality. Same thing for me with going to bed. Like our kids forever have gone to bed at 8 p.m. And just now that they're kind of middle teenage years, we're letting them stay up until 9. And when I bring that up to people, they're like their jaw drops. Your kids go to bed at 8 o'clock, and it's like, well, yeah, we've built that in for years and years and years, and it's the kids ask, "Can I go to bed now?" And because especially as a teenager, sleep is very important, and So I love this hack because it does hit close to home. So I'm glad you brought that up because it is really important to take care of yourself. And as an entrepreneur, you are an entrepreneur, how do you feel like that's kind of affected? Because there's definitely perceptions out there in the startup world of like work your ass off, right, forever. And I also think that that's pervasive in the architecture world as well. So have you had any issues with that side of things?
I think for me and for our team, we are generally older, kind of like coming at this as a second phase of career.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that does change the nature of the company quite a bit versus a company founded by and staffed by people who are in the first phase of their career. Mm-hmm. And I think it's in a number of ways.
Mm-hmm.
One is just everyone in the company is just a lot more cynical about the benefits of excessive work. Mm-hmm. And, most of us, not me, but most others have kids. So it's really a family-ish company. Mm-hmm. Our schedules vary day to day by the needs of, kids or other things. So we're definitely not the hardcore startup. But I think that makes Tonic a more considered product, and that it's not something we built with a limited amount of knowledge of the profession and a limited amount of kind of experimentation and discussion. It's something that is built after 20 years by pretty much, each of us in the profession, kind of looking at the profession, thinking about it, and then it's built relatively slowly for a product of its type as we, put something out, talk to people about it, redo it again, as we tune it for the way people are actually using it. So I think it does make a difference.
And on the other side of that, you've got these, not that there's any AU this year, but you've got those late night parties that you guys throw in your suite, and it's just torture to stay up that late.
I know. It is. Like by 11 o'clock, I am pretty much past it these days.
Yes.
Well, probably was when I was younger too. I just don't admit it.
Yeah. All right. So next question is, who influences you, Reg? Is it, who are you listening to? Who are you reading to? If you can make any recommendations, I would love to hear what those are.
Yeah. I'm a big podcast person. And I think podcasts are growing because of the convenience of consuming the information.
Mm-hmm.
So I like the true crime podcasts. There are some which are really amazing. There are some which are pretty average, but there are some like the In the Dark and I think Serial, like classic ones, which I really loved. I've listened to. Mm-hmm. One I'm listening to right now is called The End of the World with Josh Clark, which is not for the faint of heart, but I think for someone who's into science and society, it would be pretty interesting. It's pretty philosophical. Goes into not the end of the world as in, we might have a nuclear war or something. This is like the end of the world as in 1 billion years from now. And existential threats which may not come to fruition for, 1,000 years or something, but things that are very interesting to think about now and to consider in terms of humanity's place in the universe. So I like those ones. And I do read some books on architecture. I still consider myself in the design field. So I do like to get through some of the architecture books.
Well, final question, and this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time and being so generous. I would love it if you could tell people where they can find out more about you online or follow along with what your guys are doing, either personally as Reg Prentice or as Tonic DM.
I'm not a big social media person, but at Tonic we are trying to be better. So Tonic does have an Instagram account, just Tonic DM, and a Twitter account. I'm not sure you'll see too much showing up there, but I think our goal will be to maybe post less often, but about more interesting things. And LinkedIn is probably the best one. It's tonicdm.com if people want to sign up, get on the email list or whatever, but just following me or the company on LinkedIn is probably the best way to do that. I'm pretty old school, I would say. So sending me an email or just having a phone call is fine. I'm always surprised that people feel so reticent to email or just call. So few people do it that I'm always happy to have the discussion, because it's not like by any means like people are over abusing that or abusing it. It's like, no, I'd love to hear from people.
Yeah, I have to say personally, I like how I can just use your Calendly link and schedule a time with you, and you always show up. So it's fantastic.
Yeah, actually the Calendly link, which is Calendly/Reg Prentice, it's actually amazing. Very few people will just schedule an appointment, but it's actually a great way just to get in touch with me and maybe other people too. It's just to put some time on their calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for hanging out today, and this conversation has been amazing. I really feel like I learned a lot of new things today, actually, and there was a lot of great insight shared. And so going back to that original lecture in 2017 where this all started, this has been a fantastic journey, and I'm looking forward to the next part of it. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Appreciate it.
Once again, a big thank you to the sponsor of this episode, Layer App, the flexible database for architects that makes it easy to view photos, files, and project data right in Revit. Remember, start your free 14-day trial at layer.team/TRXL. Thanks for hanging out with us today. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for eTroxel. Talk to you soon.